Welcome back to Counting the Cost. At a quick glance, petrodollars have propelled oil-producing nations to the forefront of economic development. Nowhere epitomises this glittering success more than the Gulf states. But closer scrutiny shows that oil-rich nations are in danger, a danger all the more risky as it's hidden under an avalanche of huge wealth. Nicole Johnston reports now on the economic dangers that oil wealth can pose.
Living it up in the Gulf, Ahmed is an 18-year-old Qatari on holidays. Here, the country's enormous oil and gas wealth means the state pays for his university education, gives him a free plot of land, builds his house, and pays for his electricity and water bills. He knows he's lucky and he's thankful.
Many people took advantage of these benefits. They realised they're privileged. However, others did not. Those people abuse the privilege, squandering their money on luxury.
When you're born into a country that's rich in oil and gas, the state's able to create your classic welfare system. Now, while that sounds like a blessing for most, analysts say it can also be a curse. And that's because these countries are literally drowning in petrodollars.
It is good to have a welfare state. It's good to have a net underneath, that people don't fall too far down within the competition in a country. But when it goes too far, it kills incentives. And that problem is being faced now.
Gulf countries are known as rentier states. It sounds like economic jargon, but it basically means they rely almost entirely on income from oil and gas. And this money is called rent. So how can having too much oil rent possibly be considered a curse? Analysts say in the Gulf it distorts the domestic economy. And this is how. With limited local industry, the state gives people jobs in bloated, often inefficient bureaucracies. To spend the money, governments set out to develop ambitious projects, so-called white elephants. Last year, the Gulf had $1.8 trillion tied up in construction. These require a huge amount of imports, which in turn sends inflation soaring. Last year, the inflation rate in some Gulf countries hit 30%.
An inflation of 20–30% is a very dangerous thing. And that has been the result of the flow of revenue into these countries from the rise in the price of oil in the last few years, and that the governments finally couldn't hold the temptation and began to spend money, began to give handouts to their supporters, etc., etc.
For now, the oil price boom is over. This time around, the bust isn't as serious as it was in the 1980s. Then oil was selling for as low as $10 a barrel. But with a drop from $140 to around $70, it's a crude reminder that the oil revenue won't last forever. But while it does, there's an ongoing struggle in the Gulf between the ruling elite and local people.
It's not just that oil rents create dictatorships. They do in many ways, because they remove the collaboration between the ruler and the ruled. In many ways, these societies, in the Gulf, for example, were much more egalitarian societies before the coming of oil. Oil elevated the ruling families because they got a hold of this oil rent from the oil companies or from the colonial rulers in the past, and it elevated them above the people. And ever since then, to a certain extent, the people have been trying to find ways to get more of it for themselves and less for the ruling classes.
Cruising around on a jet ski in the middle of summer, the politics of oil seem far away. Most people appear content with the benefits the state gives them, but not all.
There are some negatives for these benefits. Many citizens drop out of school. Others are not self-dependent. They take their wealth as an excuse. Others are satisfied with their reliance on the charitable societies in Qatar. All those fail to take advantage of the benefits provided by the state in proper education. One should not rely on the state's wealth. Everyone should work hard and develop himself, simply to help boost our country's position on the international landscape.
Nicole Johnston for Counting the Cost.
So how can oil-rich nations best manage their wealth? Over to London now, where Felicity Barr has more.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Well, to help shed some more light on the subject, I'm joined in the studio now by Gleda Lan. She's an energy and development specialist from the Chatham House think tank here in London. Welcome to the programme. This idea of nations drowning in petrodollars, it does sound a strange concept, but how can these oil-rich countries avoid the perils of things such as a welfare system that apparently kills incentive, according to one of our guests anyway, or indeed the risk of inflation? What do they do?
Well, one thing they can do is to regulate the oil revenues that are actually coming into the country, because one of the big problems with setting in place unsustainable trends, which were mentioned earlier in the programme, is the fact that these revenues are very volatile. The global oil markets, the price changes, demand changes, the country doesn't really know what it's going to get from year to year. So several countries have set up sovereign wealth funds or stabilisation funds, which take a certain amount of money out of the country, they invest it abroad or they save it, and it's kind of a reserve for times when the oil price goes down. They can then bring a bit of that back into the economy to stabilise budgets.
So that has to be very well organised though, doesn't it, in advance, and the government has to be on board for that?
Yes, it does. I mean, there has been problems in countries where there is pressure on the government to release funds every so often, for instance, in Iran to pay for petrol subsidies, and in Nigeria in terms of state governors putting pressure on the government to release some of those funds for their own development purposes.
Which countries have actually realised the risks of relying basically too heavily on their oil and have successfully managed that? They've successfully managed ways to deal with their oil wealth.
Well, I think the example that most people raise is Norway.
Which is a strange example.
A lot of people don't think of Norway as being an oil-dependent state, but it is. And from the very beginning, the government there decided to regulate that oil wealth, to make sure that it fed into other parts of the economy, that it diversified that economy, that it grew national skills base. It decided to go slow with development to avoid that boom-bust cycle, and then in the 90s it established this sovereign stabilisation fund, which is like a pension fund for future generations, which functions very efficiently. I mean, Norway, you have to say that it benefited from having certain democratic institutions in place when the oil wealth came into the country, so it had a strong legal institutions, it had a strong parliament. So in a way it had certain benefits that other countries, when they've developed on oil revenues, lack. Another example maybe of a more developing country is Malaysia, and there it wasn't so heavily dependent on oil. It had rubber, it had palm oil, the economy was already more diversified, but the government in the 1980s put a strong emphasis on industrial development, on stimulating the manufacturing sector so there'd be other exports. It also, in the 90s, it really moved towards a knowledge economy, so it tried to attract foreign investment into the country and build national skills.
The other end of the scale, you've got countries like Venezuela and Nigeria, clearly a two-tier society where the wealth just isn't shared out at all, is it?
Well, it's shared out in different ways. Of course, there's always ways to siphon off bits of the oil wealth, and that's part of the problem in many of these countries. And that then makes it very difficult to reform, because you've got certain interest groups holding on to their positions that you know they benefit from the status quo, and when the government tries to reform, as in Nigeria has set up this excess crude account, it has made efforts to initiate transparency and anti-corruption drives, but it always finds these very, very difficult to implement because there are such powerful interest groups who are happy with the way things are.
All right, Gleda Lan, must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, last week we asked you for your views on counterfeit goods. This week we're asking you if the benefits that come with oil outweigh the disadvantages. Let us know what you think. Go to aljazeera.net/English and click on the left-hand side for the Your Views section. A reminder that you can keep up to date with these and other stories on that website. Again, click on the left-hand side for the business page. That's it from me, Mariam Namazi, this week. Thanks for watching Counting the Costs.